We know that the Linux kernel is modular in that it doesn't load all of the drivers that it could possibly ever need automatically by default. It has these modules that it dynamically loads when it discovers that it needs, like a driver for a certain sound card on boot. Now we can configure it to automatically load those modules by setting it up in a config file, which we're going to look at. Now what happens though is it'll load that module, but then behind the scenes there's some incredible dependency checking going on, and that dependency checking is really, really good at knowing what modules a particular module will depend on. There may not actually be a robot called Modbot in your system, or even in my system. I just like to think of a cheesy robot plugging in different modules in my computer. But nonetheless, the computer is really good at finding dependencies. In fact, sometimes it's too good, and we need to blacklist certain modules so that Modbot doesn't say, oh, this one will work, and put it in. I'm going to show you why we would do that and also how to do that. But we're looking at two concepts today: how to automatically load a module on boot, and how to make sure that the wrong module isn't loaded on boot automatically by the system detecting a dependency that you don't want it to use. Now here on this is an Ubuntu system, but all Linux distributions have kernels. We're going to go into the etc folder, and there's a file here called modules. So we're going to look at that. We can see right now it's empty. It says kernel modules to load at boot time. This contains the names of the kernel modules that should be loaded at boot time, one per line. Lines that begin with this are ignored. So what we would do is put the name of the module, and we would add something like E1000, which is the name of an Intel network card module. Now, normally the system automatically detects the hardware and it knows what to load, but I want to give you an example of how you can manually load a kernel module and have it done automatically on boot, even if the system doesn't, detect it on boot, like, oh, I have new hardware, I need this particular module. So this is how you would manually do it. All right. Now we're not actually going to save this because I don't want to load that module, but let's say that's loaded. Now, if there are dependencies, it will also load those dependencies. Let's say that the Intel E1000 network card also requires the PCI bus to work. Well, then it would load the PCI bus module. So it's really smart. But let's say that there are two different PCI modules. There's like PCI version 1 and PCI version 37. And by default, it's going to load PCI version 1, and we don't want that. So what we would do is blacklist it. So if we go into etc modprobe.d, first I want to show you there's a bunch of files in here. Anything with .conf is read in, right? So it doesn't matter which one you put it in. There's just some conventions here. Anything we're going to manually put in, we're going to put into blacklist.conf. So let's actually edit that file. And we're going to see there are a bunch of things that are already blacklisted. Now, what this does, it just makes it so that the kernel doesn't automatically load it. Like let's look at this Ethernet one, okay? So this is an ETH1394. This is a FireWire network device. All right, it's saying here we never want to use a FireWire network device. So if you detect a FireWire device, I do not want you to load the ETH1394 or the Ethernet module for a FireWire port. So if we put blacklist here, it's not going to load it. Even if we put in the FireWire module itself so that it activates that port, this will make sure that the kernel or Modbot or whatever, however you like to visualize it, doesn't say, oh, well, you're putting that in, why don't we also activate the Ethernet ability of that port? We don't want that, so we put blacklist in here. Same thing like that. I've done this the most with sound cards because there are like 150 different sound card drivers for the AC97 model of sound card. So a lot of times you have to blacklist a bunch of different models, and see there's a blacklisted sound card right here, right? This is saying don't load this module. That's not what I want. And this looks like it's because of an Ubuntu bug. All right. So anyway, this is where we tell it what not to load. Even if it's compiled in and it's part of the module, we would put it in here or any of the files in this folder. Anything that says blacklist space blank is going to be blacklisted. Honestly, like I mentioned, the Linux kernel is usually really good at automatically detecting hardware and loading all of the modules all on its own by detecting new hardware on the system. But if there are times where you want to manually load something, but you want it to be done on boot, that's where we would put it in the etc modules file. And then blacklisting is really important, especially if you're having problems with something like, it just doesn't work with this kernel module. Let me blacklist that so the kernel will pick another module and try to activate that one. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.